By the year 1853, far off in the rural fields of Alabama, the Sullivan twins came into the world. These children were so unsettling that medical men claimed they could not be understood by science. Kept secret within a lonely farmhouse with closed windows, their life was wiped from official papers, becoming only quiet stories in old family books and tales told late at night. This is the history of the Sullivan children, how their family kept them hidden, how physicians covered up the facts, and how their memory still shadows the few notes that remain. If you enjoy stories like this, please subscribe to the Macabre Record, and let us know in the comments where you are listening from tonight. The story starts near a small farming town in Alabama where living alone was not a choice but a way of life. In 1853, families were spread far apart, ruled by the seasons of planting, ruled by old customs, and ruled by the fear of what they could not grasp. The Sullivan house sat at the end of a dirt road, its windows covered from the inside, its chimney smoke rising long after neighbors had put out their own fires. It was a place people rarely visited, even though the family name was generally respected. People spoke well of the Sullivans during the day, but at night the talk changed. Neighbors spoke of faint cries floating across the fields when the wind blew. Some claimed they saw candlelight moving in the top rooms long after midnight. Others swore they heard voices, not one but two, speaking softly together. The Sullivans themselves said nothing. The father, Thomas Sullivan, was a man respected in the church, his hat always in his hands, his back always straight. His wife, Elelanina, was rarely seen, only appearing with her husband, her eyes kept low. For a time their secret might have been missed, seen only as one family's odd way of living. But then came the quiet talk of a birth, a hard one, a strange one, a delivery wrapped in silence. No local nurse would speak of it, even though one must have been there. After that night, the Sullivan home grew even darker. Local children learned to stay away from the farmhouse, not because they were told to, but because their feelings warned them. Some said they had seen small shapes moving behind the covered windows. Others said Thomas himself chased them away, his voice growing rougher each time someone came too close to his property. For a man once known for friendly greetings and quiet kindness, this change was troubling. Something had shifted in the Sullivan home, something strong enough to turn pride into worry. And yet the rumors only gained solid proof with the arrival of a traveling doctor. His notes, though messy and incomplete, would later suggest he had been invited, or perhaps forced, to see what the Sullivans were keeping hidden. What he wrote was short but frightening, that the twins he saw were not just unusual, but beyond what medical science knew. Children, yes, but something more. It was a traveler who first gave the whispers a solid form. In 1853, men moved through the South constantly, traders, map-makers, sellers of medicines, both real and fake. Most left little trace but a footprint in the dust. Yet one man, known only as a doctor from Georgia, stayed just long enough to leave a mark on the Sullivan secret. He was following the old road between Montgomery and Selma when he was sent toward the Sullivan farmhouse for a meal and a bed. Offering a visitor a place to stay was normal for country families then, but what the man saw and heard that night was not normal at all. He would later write in a broken note that only partly survived that the Sullivan house felt wrong. The curtains were pulled shut despite the hot, damp air, and the smell of smoke from too many lamps filled the rooms. Eleanor Sullivan, he wrote, barely spoke, and when she did, her words seemed planned, as if she was trying not to say too much. Thomas, on the other hand, was polite but nervous, his eyes always looking toward the stairs that led up. At night, the doctor claimed he heard something from above. Faint voices, quiet but clear. He described them as two children talking together, and though the words were soft, the timing was exactly the same, as if the voices moved as one. He thought it was a trick of his ears at first, but the sound kept going, disturbing him so deeply that he admitted he could not sleep. When morning came, he quickly made an excuse to leave. But curiosity was stronger than his fear, and before he left, he asked Thomas Sullivan a question. "Do you have children?" The answer, the doctor wrote, came after a long silence that felt dishonest. Thomas finally only said, "The Lord has blessed us in His way." No names, no ages, no mention of a birth. That short talk was enough to plant the first seeds of doubt. When the traveler moved on, he carried the story with him. In the next town, he told it to an innkeeper. By the next week, a metal worker in a different county was repeating the story of a family hiding twins they would not admit to. Rumors traveled faster than wagons, and soon the Sullivans were no longer just a quiet family on the edge of town. They were the source of an unease that grew bigger with every time the story was told, and with every new person who spoke, the story gained darker details that were hard to ignore. In 1853, Alabama was a place where quiet mattered more than noise. The state was new, built from wild land and cotton fields, its small towns separated by long dirt roads and pine forests. To live in the country meant to live apart, and for families like the Sullivans, being alone was both a shield and a prison. Neighbors might be miles away, meaning that secrets could stay hidden for years. But when rumors did start, they had nowhere to go, because in a land where things were scarce, talk was as necessary as food. Life in the country parts of Alabama was hard and steady. The summers boiled with heat that pressed on the skin, and winters, though short, brought a heavy cold that settled into the bones. Families got up with the sun, working the land with little rest, their survival tied to the crops. Learning was limited, medicine was basic, and old beliefs often took the place of science. A child born sick, with a strange shape, or even strange behavior could be seen as a curse, a punishment, or a sign of God's anger. People relied heavily on the Bible to understand what they could not explain, and when faith failed, fear took charge. The Sullivans lived on the edge of this world. Their farm made enough to feed them, but their keeping to themselves was noticed. While most families relied on the community, trading things, going to meetings, sharing work during planting and harvest, Thomas Sullivan became more closed off after the rumored birth of his twins. He rarely went to town, and when he did, his manner was stiff, almost doubtful, as though every word he said was carefully chosen. Eleanor was seen even less, slipping through church doors in silence, leaving quickly after the last song. For many families, this behavior might have been missed, but in a small, isolated place, differences are obvious. Why did the Sullivans stop having people over? Why were their windows shut even in the terrible heat? Why did they burn lamps all night when oil was expensive? Each question that was not answered fed the growing worry, and the land itself seemed to echo the odd feeling. Travelers passing their farm at night said they heard sounds that did not fit, voices rising softly from the fields, sometimes laughter, sometimes crying, always hard to make out. Others swore the house looked strangely lit, as if the light from the lamps leaked out from under the shutters. For people already deep in old beliefs, these details became proof. The Sullivans were not just private. They were hiding something. And whatever it was, it lived in the top rooms of that farmhouse. In Alabama, in the mid-19th century, medicine was less a science and more a difficult balance between religious belief, old stories, and whatever knowledge a doctor could put together from old European books. Most country areas had no doctor at all, relying instead on nurses, herbal healers, or neighbors with only simple, old-fashioned cures. Leeches, bloodletting, and small pieces of roots and bark were still common, and when these did not work, people prayed. In such a world, anything out of the ordinary was rarely looked at calmly. It was labeled as a bad sign, a curse, or God's anger. Children born with a club foot, a bent back, or even a very noticeable birthmark were often kept hidden by families desperate to avoid disgrace. In towns where every set of eyes watched every other house, to admit you had a child who was different meant risking being called cursed. Neighbors might refuse to trade, church groups might quietly talk about sin, and entire families could find themselves being quietly avoided. Many people believed it was simpler to keep such things secret, to close windows, to explain missing people with lies, to insist on privacy where it was not usually given. Doctors themselves could not always stop these fears. Many physicians, especially those who traveled from town to town, needed the respect of the communities to survive. To argue against local beliefs was dangerous. It risked not only their good name but their ability to earn a living. And so, when faced with something they could not explain, doctors often agreed to keep silent. Some even urged the family to hide the truth, advising them to keep the matter private rather than risk public shame. Others wrote down what they saw in private notebooks, knowing their words might never be made public, fearing that other doctors would make fun of them or call them liars. This was the world into which the Sullivan twins were born. If they were strange, badly formed, joined together, or suffered from conditions that confused understanding, it is no surprise their parents chose secrecy over public viewing. For Thomas Sullivan, a man already known for his proud manner and strict faith, the birth of children who defied explanation could only be seen as a difficult test, or worse, as a judgment. Eleanor, held by the rules of silence and obedience, would have carried this heavy load in quiet despair. And so old beliefs filled the empty space where science might have spoken. Every muffled noise from the Sullivan house became proof of sin. Every closed window was a sign of guilt. Medicine could have explained, or at least tried to understand, but in Alabama in 1853, medicine was too weak to stand against the force of fear. It was easier to hide the truth or to bury it. Before the whispers began, the Sullivan family had a reputation that most in their community viewed with quiet respect. Thomas Sullivan was not rich like the plantation owners, but he worked his land with care, producing steady crops of cotton and corn. He was known to arrive at church every Sunday, dressed simply but neatly, his Bible held tightly. He almost never missed a service, and when he did, people noticed. He did not drink, did not gamble, and rarely raised his voice. His nature, at least in the eyes of his neighbors, was that of a dependable man, firm but honest. Eleanor Sullivan, though quieter, was remembered as a kind woman. In earlier years, she had been seen taking care of the sick in her own home, nursing neighbors' children when fever hit the community, and giving food to travelers who came to their door. Her silence, which would later become a reason for doubt, had once been thought of as modesty. Together, Thomas and Eleanor seemed to stand for the values most prized in their part of Alabama: faith, hard work, and a commitment to family. But after the twins were born, something changed. Invitations to church meals were refused. Their door, once open to guests, was now closed. Those who went to the farmhouse were met with coldness, if they were let in at all. Thomas started making his trips to town shorter, his errands done quickly, his conversations brief. Eleanor almost completely vanished from public view. If she did appear, it was for a moment and always by Thomas's side, her eyes looking down as if trying not to be seen. It was not just the secrecy that drew attention, but the difference. A family, once steady in their routine, had suddenly turned inward. Neighbors, especially in small communities, quickly notice when normal life breaks, and the Sullivans' new actions raised questions that no one could answer. Some thought it was sickness, others whispered of money problems or a private shame. Yet, as weeks became months, these answers seemed less likely. Why were no sounds of playing ever heard from their house? Why did no children appear in the fields or at the church when families with new babies almost always showed off their young ones with pride? The longer the Sullivans kept away, the more their good name changed. Respect became worry, admiration turned to doubt. Because in a community where a good name was everything, secrecy was a debt no one would forgive. And the more the family hid, the more sure their neighbors became that something inside that house was never meant to be seen. No one could agree on the exact details of how the Sullivan twins entered the world, but every version of the story carried a feeling of fear. Some swore there was no nurse at all, that Ella Lanena gave birth in silence inside the farmhouse, while Thomas locked the doors, refusing any help. Others whispered that a nurse had been called from far away but was never seen in the community again, as if she had been paid to disappear with her knowledge. The truth, if it was ever known, faded into rumor. What all the stories shared, however, was the feeling that something about that birth was not normal. Older women in the church claimed they remembered hearing a cart rattling up the Sullivan Road on a stormy night, the noise of horses' feet covered by thunder. They insisted the cart belonged to a traveling healer, not a neighbor. If this was true, then perhaps even before the twins were born, the Sullivans knew they needed to be careful. Yet others argued that no cart had passed, that the birth happened alone under the darkness, and that the children's very first cries were silenced before they could reach the air outside the house. Whispered accounts were different, but one thing stayed the same. The twins were said to have been born alive, and their cries, though soft, had a sound that made those who heard it uneasy. One neighbor swore she had passed near the house at dawn, and had heard not one baby but two, crying together in a strange beat, almost as if their voices were placed on top of each other. She admitted she had walked faster, and never spoke of it until years later when the story was already widely known. The mystery around the birth itself became proof. Why had there been no church blessing? In a community where babies were usually blessed and shown to the church within weeks, the silence of the Sullivan family was shockingly loud. Even stranger was the lack of a burial record. If the children had died, as Thomas later told one neighbor in a sharp reply, where were their graves? The churchyard had no markers, and the Sullivan property showed no sign of recently dug earth. So the questions grew. Were the children strangely formed in some horrible way? Were they sick and weak, unable to live? Or were they something completely different, something their parents could not let the world see? Whatever the truth, the night they were born was the moment the Sullivan home became less a place to live and more a deep mystery. Its windows shut, not only against the weather, but against the eyes of the entire community. After the night of their birth, the twins seemed to disappear into silence, as if the walls of the Sullivan farmhouse had swallowed them whole. In a community where new life was often shared openly, their absence became a troubling presence of its own. Neighbors who expected to see Ella Lanena at church with babies in her arms instead saw her arrive alone, her face tired, her hands tightly squeezed as if holding something invisible. When asked about her children, she said little, sometimes nothing at all. The silence spoke more loudly than any words could have. Thomas became harder in his manner. Once known for staying to talk after services, he now kept his replies short, his eyes looking at the ground. He discouraged people from visiting, turning away those who came offering help or just curiosity. Even friends of the family found they were not welcome. In a time when inviting guests was not just a habit but a need, this refusal seemed strange to many. But if Thomas felt guilt, he did not show it. Instead, he acted like a man protecting something too weak or too terrible to be seen. Those who lived closest to the Sullivans started to notice other things. The curtains of the upstairs windows never moved, even when the summer air was too hot to stand. Lamps burned late into the night, their soft light leaking through small spaces in the shutters. On quiet evenings, sounds floated across the fields, soft noises that might have been children, though the voices seemed odd in sound, strangely timed. A few swore they heard laughing, but it was laughter that was disturbing rather than comforting, like sounds played back through an empty room. The Sullivans themselves gave no answers. To questions about children, Thomas replied that God gives and takes as he chooses, a statement so unclear it did not satisfy anyone. Elela Nena, pale and quiet, seemed to withdraw further into herself, her visits to town decreasing until even at church she seemed like a ghost, present in body but gone in spirit. The act of hiding had consequences. Doubt became certainty among the neighbors, who began to share their thoughts in quiet voices. Some said the twins had died and were hidden in graves without markers. Others claimed the children were still alive, but had physical flaws so shocking the parents would not let them be seen. A few went further, suggesting that what the Sullivans hid was not just a sickness, but a curse carried in the flesh, a punishment sent to the family for secret sins. The deeper the Sullivans went into silence, the louder the rumors grew outside their walls. By the second year after the twins' birth, the farmhouse had become a notable place of fear in the country. Neighbors passing on the dirt road at night began to tell stories of strange lights shining through the cracks of the shutters. Some said it was just lamplight, but others swore the glow was unnatural, a light that flickered in a way no fire could. A few went further, insisting that colored light, faint blue or even green, sometimes spilled softly into the dark, coloring the grass with its shine before disappearing. The sounds were worse. Children walking home from work near evening whispered that they heard voices coming from the Sullivan property. Not the happy sounds of play, not the crying of babies, but something else. Soft murmurs, sometimes together, sometimes breaking into sharp bursts like pieces of a conversation that made no sense. On quiet nights, when the insects stopped and the wind was still, the voices traveled farther. A farmer swore he heard two voices singing together, though the song had no tune, only a dull repeating sound that left him chilled long after he had rushed past. Animals, too, seemed bothered by the farmhouse. Horses would not pull wagons past the Sullivan gate without fighting, stamping and pulling as if resisting an invisible hand. Dogs, usually uncaring about such things, barked wildly at the fence line and could not be brought closer. Some neighbors began to say clearly that the land itself had turned bad, that whatever was hidden inside the Sullivan home had begun to leak out, spoiling the very ground. Whispers became strong enough to be heard in church, where families leaned close to share their worries during sermons. Some held on to the belief that the twins were simply born with defects, their looks so strange that Thomas and Elelanena wanted to save them from being made fun of. Others believed the children were not just strange, but touched by something evil, that their condition was not a problem with the body, but with the spirit. A few even muttered that the Sullivans had made a deal with unholy powers and that the children were the proof of it. Through all of this, Thomas remained firm, Elelanena silent. The shutters stayed closed, the lights burned late, and the sounds kept spilling into the night. Every new report, every new voice in the dark became another piece of proof in a growing tale. Whatever lived inside that house, the community believed, was not meant to be seen by human eyes. In an area where formal doctors were rare, traveling doctors were both a help and a strange sight. They came with small carts carrying bottles of liquids, powders, and tools, offering cures for problems that local remedies could not fix. Many were frauds, selling fake medicines as cures, but a few were real medical men, educated in cities, moving constantly from one country town to the next, looking for patients, money, and sometimes just a reason to travel. It was one such doctor who was said to have discovered the Sullivan secret. The man's name, if it was ever known, is lost now, but pieces of his notes survived in a county record office many years later. He wrote about visiting the Sullivan farm, pretending to offer cures for fever. Thomas let him in, though he did not want to, and Elena stayed in the shadows. The doctor noted the house was dark, the shutters nailed tight, the air heavy with the smell of oil and old wood. He also noticed something else, a strange quiet broken by soft sounds floating from upstairs. He wrote that he first thought it was children sick with a cough, but the noises did not sound like illness. They were steady, planned, more like talking than coughing. When the doctor asked directly, Thomas became angry, insisting there were no children in the house, that his family had lost someone and wanted to mourn in peace. Yet later that evening, when the doctor stayed longer than was welcome, he claimed to have quickly seen movement at the top of the stairs. Two small figures standing close together in the darkness, their shapes not clear. He described the feeling that they were watching him, though he could not clearly see their faces. The image haunted him so much that he later wrote he felt the stare of two, though they moved as one. Whatever he saw that night was enough to shake him deeply. In his scattered notes, he spoke of things that were wrong, physically, behaviorally, or both, but gave no details. Either he was afraid of being laughed at, or he feared the danger of writing such things down. He left the Sullivan home at dawn and never came back, but his visit was enough to start new whispers, because the doctor spoke to one man in town quietly, almost in trust, and from that seed another set of rumors began to grow. The pieces that remain of the Sullivan twins' existence offer only short looks, but those looks are enough to cause worry. The physician who visited their home never wrote a full description, but in one of his surviving notes he wrote of forms that could not be easily seen. Some later claimed this was a careful way of suggesting being misshapen, a polite refusal to write down uglier details. Yet others argued that his hesitation spoke of something deeper, that what he had seen did not fit clearly into any medical category at all. Neighbors who insisted they had heard the children described voices that seemed unnatural. When one child spoke, the other repeated it, not like copying, but at the exact same time, the two voices going up and down together as though they had practiced. A farmer's wife claimed she once waited outside the Sullivan fence in the evening and heard the twins laughing, but the sound gave her chills because there was no difference between the two sounds. They were exactly the same, overlapping, the same noise doubled. She swore it made her think not of children, but of a single voice folded back on itself. Other stories described how they moved. A boy who had climbed a large tree near the Sullivan land told of seeing two shapes briefly at the upstairs window. He said they moved at the same moment, stepping forward and back together, as if one shadow was controlling both of them. When he told his parents what he saw, he was punished for lying. Yet the memory stayed with him into his adult years, and he repeated it when the story of the Sullivans came up again later. There were details about their bodies, too, though they are the least trustworthy. Some claimed the twins were joined at the middle, connected so closely that separating them would have been impossible. Others believed they shared one body with two heads, or that one twin was twisted onto the other like a reversed reflection. A few went so far as to whisper that their eyes never looked apart, always staring together in one direction, as if their sight was locked. None of these descriptions can be proved, but all lead to the same idea. Whatever the twins looked like, they were unsettling enough that their family chose to keep them secret rather than face public view. The medical papers of the time, even those lost and forgotten, have no official record of the Sullivan twins. It is as if the children were purposely left out, removed before their story could ever be checked. And where there were no facts, rumor took hold, growing into a legend, until the twins became less like children and more like ghosts, haunting the history of one family. When people talked about the twins' appearance, even the most reasonable voices started using words of the strange and unnatural. Conjoined children were not unheard of in the 19th century, but they were rare enough to be seen as miracles or as terrible deformities, depending on who judged them. The most famous pair, Chang and Eng Bunker, had traveled around America as living oddities only decades before, yet even they were met with both great interest and strong disgust. To imagine such a thing appearing in a quiet Alabama farmhouse, far from the strange sights of the cities, was enough to spark the minds of an entire county. But the descriptions of the Sullivan twins never matched clearly with known cases. Joined at the chest, at the hip, or joined so fully that they shared body parts, arms, or even a mind. The whispers became more confused with every retelling. One story claimed they moved as one body, though each had a separate face. Another swore the children never seemed to grow older, that years passed, but their forms stayed the same, as if stuck in babyhood. A few went even further, muttering that the children had powers beyond the human body, that they spoke words in languages no one had taught them, or that they knew about events in the community before they happened. These claims were probably just wild stories, born of fear, but once they became part of the tale, they stuck firmly. The more amazing the rumor, the more it traveled. Farmers who had never seen the twins swore they knew what they looked like. Women who had never stepped inside the farmhouse described the children's cries as if they had heard them themselves. It became impossible to tell true memory from made-up stories, fact from extra details. Yet this very confusion gave the story its strength. For if no one could say for sure what the twins were, then they could be anything, monsters, miracles, or something in the middle. Science might have made things clear, but in the Alabama countryside of 1853, science was weak, covered up by old beliefs and fear. A doctor who studied the twins risked not only his trustworthiness, but his standing with the church and community. It was easier then to let the matter go unspoken, and so, where there should have been a medical explanation, there was silence. Where there should have been a record, there was a scrubbing away. And in that scrubbing away, the legend of the Sullivan twins only grew until they stopped being children at all and became something much stranger, living symbols of what could not or would not be explained. If Thomas Sullivan was the wall that kept curious neighbors away, then Elena was the quiet guard of the secret itself. Those who remembered her before the twins' birth described her as kind, quick to smile, and soft-spoken, but always present. Afterward, she seemed to fade into the shadows. When she did appear, her eyes were downcast, her face pale, her body thin, as though nights without sleep had drained her. She rarely spoke, and when she did, her words were brief and careful, as if she was scared of giving away something with the wrong sentence. It was Elena, more than Thomas, who seemed to carry the weight of hiding on her shoulders. Stories spread of her daily tasks, learned from neighbors who claimed to have watched the Sullivan property. She was seen carrying trays of food up the thin stairs at strange times, always alone, never with her husband. Sometimes she would wait at the window in the top room, pulling the curtain back just enough to peek into the yard, her face white in the glow of lamplight, before quickly pulling back. At other times, neighbors swore they heard her singing softly, almost like a bedtime song, though the words were unclear. These small pieces of information, along with the fact that she never publicly admitted to having children, created the image of a mother locked in a private watch over her hidden offspring. Her silence outside the home was just as revealing. When approached by women in the church who tried to be kind, Elena offered no explanations, only short nods and tight smiles. One neighbor remembered asking her directly if she had been blessed with children. Eleanor, after a long pause, simply whispered, "They are with me," before turning away. The phrase was heavy with meaning. It was not saying no, but it was not saying yes either. As months became years, Elena's keeping to herself became more extreme. While Thomas still appeared in town, stiff and careful, Elena disappeared completely from public life. At church, she sat without speaking, her hands tightly gripping her prayer book, her stare fixed on the altar but empty. People whispered that she was wasting away, eaten up by a secret too terrible to bear. Others guessed she had gone mad, driven to a complete focus by the job of hiding what should never have been hidden. Whatever her state of mind, one truth was clear. Elena's life became all about hiding her children. If Thomas built the walls around the twins, Elena was the one who lived inside those walls, tied to them by feelings of fear, guilt, and perhaps a love that had become something desperate. She became, in the eyes of her neighbors, less a woman and more a ghost, haunting her own house. If Elena carried the daily weight of secrecy inside the house, Thomas carried the public weight of it. A man of stiff bearing and strict belief, Thomas Sullivan had long been viewed as a figure of moral strength in his community. He often quoted the Bible, rarely missed Sunday service, and was known to rule his household with a strong will. But after the twins' birth, those who knew him began to see a shift in his manner. Subtle at first, then impossible to miss. The man who once greeted neighbors with firm handshakes now passed them with quick nods. His voice, once strong and sure, became tense, as though every word was a rock held in his mouth. In the 19th century South, faith was both a defense and a weapon. For a man like Thomas, it should have been the answer to any problem, and yet the existence of children who defied explanation troubled his beliefs. If they were a gift, why did they bring such shame? If they were a curse, what sin had brought it down upon his home? Some believed Thomas turned more deeply to the church, looking for forgiveness in rituals and the Bible. Others whispered, he became harsher, almost daring God himself to explain why this had been put upon him. His talks, when he read aloud in men's groups, started to sound angry. He focused on parts about punishment and anger, on stories of the unclean being cast out from the faithful. At times he spoke of Job, the man tested beyond what he could handle, but even then his words seemed less about patience than about fighting back. It was as if he was trying to convince himself as much as anyone listening that he was still in control. The secrecy, however, wore him down. Neighbors remembered his temper suddenly exploding in ways it never had before. Sudden loud responses when asked about his family, tightly closed fists when he heard gossip. One shopkeeper remembered him throwing coins onto the counter so hard they scattered across the floor when asked kindly about his wife's health. To some, this anger was a sign of guilt. To others, it was simply the breakdown of a man trapped between what he had to do, the shame, and his faith. In the end, Thomas became a figure both feared and pitied. His silence was no longer the silence of pride, but of a man trapped by events too big to name. Where faith should have given comfort, it left him. Script ends abruptly.